sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the quiet streets. In a small, cozy cafe at the corner of the town, a young pianist was finishing up the evening shift. The cafe was not busy, just a few regulars sipping coffee and chatting quietly. The piano in the corner had been there for years, worn at the edges and slightly out of tune, but it was the pianist's favorite place to practice. It was a safe spot where no one expected perfection, and that made it special. The young pianist wiped the counter, humming softly, fingers tapping a gentle rhythm on the worn surface. Music had always been a part of life, something that felt like breathing. It was not just a hobby or a dream, it was a part of the soul. But the pianist had always kept it small, hidden. Life had responsibilities, bills, and routines that made grand dreams seem distant. Playing in front of people beyond family or friends had never been imagined seriously. Yet here, in this quiet cafe, the piano always felt like a world of possibilities. Tonight, the cafe had an unusual guest. A man in a crisp suit, with an air of confidence and quiet curiosity, had come in. He was not someone the pianist had met before, but he seemed interested in the music, pausing near the piano and watching with a thoughtful expression. There was something about the way he looked, the way he noticed small details, that made the pianist uneasy at first. Not in fear, but in a subtle awareness that this was not just a random observer. The pianist cleared a small space on the piano top, arranging the sheet music, even though most of it would be played from memory. Fingers hovered above the keys for a moment, catching a faint smile from a regular customer who had come to enjoy the evening music. The air smelled faintly of coffee and baked bread, a comforting mix that always made concentration easier. Then, with a quiet breath, the pianist began to play. The first notes were soft, careful, almost shy. The melody moved gently through the room, a simple tune that fit the mood of the quiet evening. The pianist's hands felt nervous at first, the fingers stiff from tension, but slowly, as they settled into the music, a warmth spread. There was a rhythm in the heart, a quiet pulse that guided the fingers. The notes began to flow more naturally, more confidently. It was as if the piano had been waiting for this moment, and the pianist was only beginning to understand its voice. The man in the suit moved a little closer, leaning against the wall, eyes fixed on the piano. He did not speak, did not interrupt, but there was a quiet attention that felt almost heavy. The pianist was aware of it, a subtle pressure, but it did not break the flow. In fact, it made the music more alive, more urgent in its honesty. Each note seemed to carry more than sound. It carried emotion, a story that had been quiet for so long. The melody rose and fell, delicate yet firm, moving through the small cafe like a gentle storm. When the song ended, the pianist exhaled, hands lingering on the keys, listening to the echoes. The cafe was silent for a moment, a quiet pause where the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the man spoke, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made it clear he was serious. "You have a gift," he said simply. "Not many can make music like that. Would you be willing to play for a small gathering? Nothing formal, just a trial performance." The words hung in the air. The pianist blinked, unsure at first. A trial performance? For someone like him? It felt strange and almost impossible. Life had never included invitations like this. It had included small performances for friends, practice sessions, even little moments of courage on the cafe piano. But this felt bigger, something that could change the quiet routine that had been so safe for so long. The pianist shook the head slightly, trying to dismiss the thought. "I don't know. I've never done anything like that before. It's just a small hobby for me," the voice said, soft and hesitant. The man smiled, a small, encouraging gesture. "Exactly because it is small, it has power. You play with honesty. That is rare. This is not about perfection. It's about music that touches people. Trust me, this will not be an ordinary evening. Give it a try." There was a pause. The pianist's mind raced. Could it be real? Could someone actually see what music meant, not just technically, but as something alive and moving? The idea of playing for more than a handful of people, of stepping into a space where judgment and expectation existed, was terrifying. Yet there was a spark in it too, something that whispered quietly in the heart. Finally, the pianist nodded, not fully understanding the decision, but knowing it felt right. "Okay," came the soft reply. "I'll do it." The man's smile widened, warm and approving. "Good. You'll see. Just play as you always do. Don't think about anything else. Let the music guide you." That night, after the cafe closed, the pianist stayed behind, practicing quietly, fingers moving over the keys, feeling the way the music responded. There was a nervous energy, a tightness in the chest that came from knowing something significant was about to happen. Each note carried the weight of possibility. There were mistakes, little slips of the fingers, but they did not matter. The sound was still alive, still beautiful, still real. As the days passed, the pianist began to prepare for the trial performance. It was not just about memorizing notes, but about understanding the emotion behind them. Each evening became a journey, exploring the music in ways never tried before. Sometimes, fingers flew across the keys in excitement, creating melodies that were raw and unrefined but powerful in their honesty. Sometimes the pianist would pause, staring at the piano, wondering if this was really happening, if anyone would truly notice. Friends and coworkers noticed the change too. The pianist smiled more, walked with a little more confidence, and spoke often about music in ways that carried excitement. There was a quiet energy in the small apartment or the modest practice space. Instruments hummed, fingers ached, but there was joy in it. Music had always been a companion, but now it was also a promise of something more. The night of the trial finally arrived. The pianist was nervous, heart racing, stomach tight. The small gathering was waiting in a private room. A few chairs set up, soft lighting, an intimate setting. It was nothing like a concert hall, nothing like the grand performances imagined in dreams. Yet, somehow, the intimacy made it more personal, more real. The pianist took a deep breath, walking toward the piano, fingers brushing the keys lightly, feeling the texture of the worn wood. The first note was soft, hesitant, just as it had been in the cafe. But slowly, as the pianist settled into the rhythm, the music began to flow naturally, a river of sound that filled the room. There was a subtle power in it, a quiet intensity that drew the listeners in. Eyes widened, smiles appeared, heads tilted, and in the silence between the notes, the pianist could feel the audience listening, truly listening. As the music continued, nerves melted into focus. Each movement of the fingers was deliberate yet instinctive, as if the piano and the pianist were communicating without words. There was a joy in the sound, a beauty that could not be contained. Notes rose and fell, creating moments of tension and release, melodies that seemed to speak directly to the heart. The pianist could feel the connection, the invisible thread that joined performer and audience, and it was exhilarating. When the last note lingered in the air and finally faded, the room was silent for a heartbeat. Then, quietly at first, applause began. It grew steadily, warm and genuine, a recognition of something rare and unrepeatable. The pianist exhaled, fingers hovering over the keys, heart pounding, a mixture of relief and triumph flooding in. This small trial, which had seemed so daunting, had become something magical, a moment of shared wonder. The man in the suit approached afterward, eyes shining with appreciation. "You see," he said softly, "music like that does not need grand stages or lights. It only needs truth. Tonight you shared your truth. That is the beginning of something remarkable." The pianist smiled, still a little breathless, still unsure of what the next step would be, but certain of one thing: the world had shifted. What had begun as a simple, quiet trial in a small room had become a spark of something much larger. A door had opened, and for the first time, the pianist felt that stepping through it could lead to a life where music was not just a hidden joy but a force that could touch others, deeply and beautifully. That night, walking home under the stars, the pianist replayed the music in the mind, not the mistakes or the doubts, but the moments where everything felt alive. Each note seemed to glow, each chord carried warmth, each pause held meaning. The trial had not just been a performance. It had been a revelation. And as the city slept quietly, the pianist allowed a smile, knowing that the first chapter of a larger story had begun. And there was no turning back. After the small trial performance, the young pianist returned to the quiet apartment, feeling a mixture of excitement and unease. The night had been magical, more than anyone could have imagined. Yet a shadow of doubt lingered. What if the next performance did not go as well? What if the confidence that had carried the music through tonight disappeared when faced with a larger audience? These thoughts circled in the mind, relentless and quiet, a gentle storm that matched the rhythm of a restless heart. In the days that followed, the pianist devoted every free moment to practice. Mornings were spent at the piano, fingers tracing the keys as the sun spilled through the windows, casting patterns of light on the floor. Afternoons were for experimenting with new pieces, some familiar and comforting, others challenging and strange, stretching the limits of what had been learned so far. Each note became a question, each chord a conversation. The music was no longer just a hobby. It had become a living, breathing thing that demanded attention, care, and understanding. Yet, for all the dedication, uncertainty remained. Sometimes, while practicing a particularly difficult piece, the pianist would freeze, hands hovering over the keys, mind clouded with fear of making mistakes. The thought of the audience waiting, even if only a small one, was heavy. Doubts crept in about skill, about timing, about whether the music was truly good enough to be shared. There were moments of frustration, when fingers fumbled, notes went wrong, and the melody seemed to vanish before it could be caught again. During these moments, the pianist often thought about the man in the suit. His words had been simple, yet they carried weight. It is not about perfection. It is about truth. Play what you feel. The pianist replayed the phrase like a mantra, reminding that music was not a test to pass but a story to tell. Slowly, the nervousness transformed into something else. A quiet determination, a recognition that mistakes were part of the journey, not the end of it. Friends and coworkers noticed a change in the pianist. There was a new energy in movements, a lightness in the steps, a spark in the eyes. Conversations often turned to music, with the pianist describing melodies, improvisations, and little experiments with the sound. Even during breaks at work, thoughts drifted back to compositions, new arrangements, and ways to express emotions that words could not reach. Music had become the center of attention in life, a constant companion that demanded more than casual attention. As the date of the next performance approached, the anticipation grew. It was not just another small gathering this time. The audience would include local music enthusiasts, critics, and people who had influence in the music world. The thought of it was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Nights became restless, with sleep interrupted by imagined scenarios of playing in front of strangers, of stumbling over notes, or of moments when the heart raced faster than the fingers could move. The pianist decided to structure the practice in a disciplined way. Mornings were for revisiting familiar pieces, allowing confidence to build with music already mastered. Afternoons were for new, challenging pieces, where improvisation could expand skills and expressiveness. Evenings were for reflection, listening to recordings of past performances, and analyzing both strengths and weaknesses. There was no rush, but there was focus. Each day built on the last, a quiet layering of preparation that carried both skill and emotion forward. Occasionally, the pianist would pause and simply sit at the piano, letting hands rest on the keys without playing a single note. These moments were for thinking, for dreaming, for imagining how music could move people. There was a strange, almost meditative calm in these silences, a sense that the piano had become not just an instrument but a mirror, reflecting the deepest emotions and fears. The music that flowed afterward was often the strongest, born from honesty rather than technique. One evening, while practicing a particularly complex piece, the pianist made a small mistake. Fingers hit a wrong note, a rhythm skipped, and for a moment, panic threatened to take over. The music faltered. The pianist froze, eyes wide, heart racing. Then, taking a deep breath, the decision came naturally. Continue. Do not stop. Do not try to erase the mistake. just keep moving forward. And as the fingers found their place again, the melody resumed, richer, more alive, as if the error had added depth to the performance. The pianist began to realize that preparation was more than just practicing notes. It was about learning to manage nerves, to trust instincts, and to embrace imperfections. Every stumble became a lesson, every hesitation a reminder that music was living and unpredictable. This understanding brought a quiet confidence, one that did not rely on perfection but on authenticity. The music was not only in the hands but in the heart, in the willingness to feel and express without fear. Friends noticed the change more and more. Some stopped by the apartment to listen, drawn by curiosity or a desire to support. They often left quietly, eyes glistening, impressed not just by the technical skill but by the emotion in the performance. The pianist felt a mixture of pride and humility, realizing that music was not about showing off ability, but about creating connection. Even strangers could feel the resonance of honesty in sound. Despite growing confidence, moments of doubt continued. On a rainy afternoon, sitting by the window and listening to the patter of raindrops, the pianist felt suddenly small again. The thought of the upcoming trial performance loomed like a mountain, intimidating and vast. Would it truly be possible to move a larger audience? Would nerves betray the music? Would the melodies that flowed so naturally in solitude survive scrutiny? In these moments, the pianist often returned to the first trial, remembering how the audience had reacted, how the music had connected in ways that words could not describe. That memory became a source of courage, a reminder that fear was not a barrier but a companion on the journey. Every note played from the heart carried truth, and that truth had power beyond imagination. The week before the trial, preparation intensified. Mornings and evenings were dedicated to perfecting timing, refining dynamics, and exploring emotional expression. Even breaks at work were spent humming melodies, tapping rhythms, and imagining performances. Each practice session was both exhausting and exhilarating. There was a constant push to improve while remaining honest to personal style, a balance between discipline and freedom. One afternoon, the pianist received a message from the man in the suit. It was brief but encouraging. The trial is approaching. Remember, music is your voice. Trust it. Let it speak. Reading the words, the pianist felt a mix of nervous excitement and calm resolve. The message was simple, yet it carried weight. It was a reminder that the upcoming performance was not about impressing others, but about sharing what had always lived inside. As the day of the trial arrived, nerves were intense. The pianist woke early, heart beating fast, yet a sense of purpose carried through the morning. The apartment felt small, familiar, and comforting, but also heavy with anticipation. Every key was polished in thought, every movement rehearsed in mind. It was more than preparation. It was a ritual, a way to align heart, mind, and fingers for what was to come. The journey to the performance location was quiet. The pianist walked through the streets, feeling the cool air and listening to the city sounds, letting them settle the mind. Each step was a reminder that the trial was a step forward, a chance to move from small, private practice into a world that could respond, react, and connect. There was fear, but there was also exhilaration, a thrill in the unknown, in the possibility of creating something unforgettable. Upon arriving, the pianist saw the small gathering beginning to take shape. The room was simple, intimate, with soft lighting and carefully arranged chairs. There were familiar faces, strangers, and a few people whose presence carried quiet authority. The atmosphere was calm, yet charged with expectation. The pianist's heart raced, but a deep breath brought focus. This was a chance to play, to share, to be heard. Nothing more, nothing less. Before sitting at the piano, the pianist paused, fingers brushing the keys, feeling the texture of the worn wood, remembering the countless hours of practice, the mistakes, the triumphs, the doubts, and the joy. The room was quiet. Then, slowly, the pianist began to play. At first, the notes were soft, cautious, almost shy. But with each measure, confidence grew. The music became a river, flowing through the room, touching listeners in ways that words could not. Eyes widened, heads tilted, expressions softened. Some leaned forward, absorbed. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. The pianist felt the energy of the room, a quiet connection that grew with every note. Mistakes happened, small slips that would have caused panic in the past. But now they were woven into the music, adding depth and life. The melody carried both technical skill and raw emotion, a combination that was impossible to ignore. When the last note faded, there was a pause, a collective holding of breath. Then applause erupted, warm, genuine, and full of appreciation. The pianist exhaled, a mix of relief and pride filling the chest. The small trial had become more than expected. What had begun as preparation and doubt had transformed into a shared experience, a moment of connection and understanding. The man in the suit approached afterward, eyes bright with approval. "You see," he said, "this is what happens when you trust yourself. The music carries truth and people respond. Remember this feeling. It is the beginning of something bigger." Walking home later that night, the pianist felt exhausted yet alive, a mixture of relief, joy, and quiet anticipation. The trial had tested nerves, skill, and courage, but it had also opened a door. The music was no longer just private joy. It was a bridge to the world. And as the city lights flickered softly in the distance, the pianist smiled, knowing that preparation, patience, and belief had led to this moment, and that the next steps, though uncertain, held endless possibilities. The day of the main performance arrived with a quiet intensity. The young pianist woke early, heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nerves that made it difficult to focus. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the familiar walls almost pressing in as the mind ran through melodies, finger positions, and possible mistakes. Every note seemed to echo in the imagination. Every chord held the weight of anticipation. Yet beneath the nerves, there was a sense of purpose, a quiet determination that had been growing for days. This performance was more than a trial. It was a chance to step into a new world. As the pianist prepared, fingers brushed over the keys, feeling the familiar texture and weight. Each note was a reminder of countless hours of practice, of moments when mistakes had become lessons, and doubt had been transformed into confidence. The piano had become more than an instrument. It was a companion, a voice for emotions too deep for words. And now it would speak to more than just the performer. The performance venue was a small private hall, intimate yet elegant. The lighting was soft, warm, highlighting the piano in the center, the keys gleaming slightly under the lamps. Chairs were arranged carefully, facing the instrument, and a modest number of guests had arrived. Music enthusiasts, local artists, a few critics, and others whose presence carried quiet authority. The atmosphere was calm, yet charged with expectation, a tension that made every heartbeat feel louder. The pianist entered quietly, carrying both instruments of preparation and the invisible weight of responsibility. The audience greeted with polite smiles, some curious, some skeptical, and some quietly hopeful. The moment felt heavier than the mind had imagined. Sitting at the piano, fingers hovering above the keys, the pianist inhaled deeply, feeling the cool air and the stillness of the room. It was not just a performance anymore. It was a chance to reach hearts. The first note was soft, cautious, almost hesitant. It floated through the hall like a gentle whisper, testing the waters. Then, as the fingers settled, the music began to flow more freely, confident yet tender. The melody moved like a story unfolding, gentle at first, then gradually building, carrying emotion with each rise and fall. The pianist's hands seemed to dance naturally, guided by instinct as much as practice, responding to a rhythm that lived beyond notes on a page. The audience leaned in, some with closed eyes, letting the music wrap around them. There was a subtle change in the air, an energy that grew with every passing measure. What had started as a quiet trial now carried the weight of possibility, and the room responded in kind. Heads tilted, expressions softened, and a few faces glowed with the recognition of something rare. Music that was alive, not just played, but felt. As the performance continued, the pianist felt a strange and wonderful shift. Nerves gave way to flow, fear melted into focus, and each note became more daring, more expressive. Improvisation crept in, tiny flourishes that had not been planned, but felt inevitable. The piano was no longer an object. It was a partner, a voice amplifying what had always been inside. Every chord, every pause, every rising melody told a story, personal yet universal, private yet shared. Halfway through the performance, a noticeable change occurred. One of the guests, a person with an air of influence in the music world, shifted forward in the seat, eyes widening with interest. Another leaned closer, listening more intently than before. The pianist, though absorbed in the music, could feel the subtle energy of the audience responding, a silent recognition that this was no ordinary performance. The room seemed to breathe in rhythm with the music, as if the walls themselves were attuned to the flow. The pianist's confidence grew with the awareness of this connection. The hands moved faster, smoother, yet with precision, as if anticipating the next note before it arrived. Improvisation expanded further, weaving through the familiar pieces, blending melodies into a tapestry that was both intricate and heartfelt. It was a delicate balance, risk and control, spontaneity and mastery, fear and courage, all merging into one powerful current. At one point, a subtle mistake occurred. A note struck slightly off-key. A rhythm misaligned for a brief moment. For a split second, panic could have taken over, but it did not. The pianist adapted, incorporated the sound into the melody, transforming what could have been a flaw into a new texture in the music. It was a small moment, almost invisible, but it reflected the essence of true artistry. Trust in instinct, courage to continue, and the ability to turn imperfection into beauty. The audience, sensing the authenticity and vulnerability of the performance, responded instinctively. Applause erupted softly after certain phrases, gentle yet encouraging, urging the pianist onward. Some guests whispered among themselves, commenting on the emotion and skill, while others remained silent, fully absorbed, letting the music speak directly to the heart. There was no judgment, no criticism, only appreciation of something real and alive. As the performance reached its peak, the pianist felt an almost overwhelming energy. The music became a storm, powerful yet controlled, sweeping through the hall, moving from quiet, tender moments to bold, dramatic flourishes. Fingers moved like lightning, chords struck with purpose, and melodies intertwined in ways that seemed impossible to plan. The pianist was no longer aware of individual notes, only the overall flow, the rising and falling, the emotional journey that carried both performer and audience along. The hall vibrated with the sound, and for a moment, it felt as if time itself had paused. No one moved, no one breathed noticeably, except for the music itself. Every note carried weight, every chord told a story, every pause held meaning. The pianist could feel the audience's hearts in rhythm with the music, the collective pulse of attention and wonder. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and beautiful all at once. Toward the end of the performance, the music softened again, returning to a quiet, tender place. The storm receded, leaving a gentle warmth that lingered in the air. Fingers traced the final notes with care, allowing each to resonate fully, fading slowly into silence. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then, as if released from a spell, applause filled the hall, warm, genuine, and sustained. It was not polite or obligatory. It was heartfelt, a recognition of something rare and extraordinary. The pianist exhaled deeply, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and pride washing over. Hands hovered over the keys, still tingling from the energy of the performance. Eyes met those of the audience, noticing the smiles, the glistening eyes, the subtle nods of appreciation. The music had not only been heard but felt. It had crossed the boundaries of simple performance, becoming a shared experience, an intimate connection between hearts and souls. After the applause, the man in the suit approached, eyes bright and approving. "Do you see what happened?" he asked quietly, almost rhetorically. "The trial has grown into something more." The music spoke for itself and people responded. That is the power you carry, and it is only beginning. The pianist smiled, still catching the breath, feeling both humbled and elated. The small trial had blossomed into a performance that exceeded imagination. What had begun as a private experiment, a cautious step into the unknown, had transformed into a revelation. The music was no longer confined to practice or imagination. It had become a living force, capable of moving people deeply and instantly. Guests approached afterward, offering words of encouragement, admiration, and curiosity. Some wanted to know about technique, others about inspiration, and a few simply wanted to express the impact the music had on them. Each interaction reinforced the realization that music was not just skill or entertainment. It was communication, connection, and emotional resonance. The pianist listened, smiled, and nodded, absorbing the appreciation while still processing the wonder of what had just occurred. Even as the performance ended, its effects lingered. The pianist walked home slowly, hands still tingling from the energy, mind replaying the melodies in endless loops. Every step seemed lighter, every sound of the city amplified by the awareness of what had been achieved. This performance had been a turning point, a moment that would shape the future in ways that could not yet be measured. That night, lying awake in bed, the pianist reflected on the journey. The fear that had loomed so heavily before the performance had vanished, replaced by confidence and clarity. Preparation, practice, and persistence had paid off, but it was more than that. It was the honesty of expression, the courage to play from the heart, and the willingness to embrace imperfection that had made the performance unforgettable. The realization was profound. Music was a language without words, and tonight it had spoken volumes. It had reminded both performer and audience of the power of authenticity, the beauty of vulnerability, and the shared experience of emotion. The storm of sound had been more than technique. It had been a revelation, an awakening, a connection that would linger far beyond the notes themselves. As sleep finally came, the pianist felt a quiet smile. The performance had been a storm, but it had left calm in its wake. A calm filled with promise, opportunity, and understanding. What had started as a small trial had grown into something extraordinary, something that could not have been predicted or forced. It was proof that courage, honesty, and dedication could transform even the simplest steps into moments of brilliance. The applause had barely faded when a surprising energy filled the room. The pianist had thought the performance was over, that the connection with the audience had reached its peak, but the atmosphere suggested otherwise. People were leaning forward, speaking quietly among themselves, and some were pointing toward a small group in the corner. The pianist's curiosity piqued, wondering what had drawn such attention. It was clear now that the gathering had grown larger than expected. A few latecomers had slipped in quietly, drawn by curiosity or perhaps invited by someone in the audience. Among them were people whose presence carried weight, organizers of concerts, local music critics, and even a few influential patrons. The energy in the room had shifted subtly but unmistakably. What began as an intimate performance now carried the quiet intensity of a small, high-stakes event. The pianist felt a flicker of nervousness, a subtle tightening in the chest, but it was quickly replaced by a rising determination. Each note already played had resonated honestly, and now there was a chance to expand, to explore further, to push beyond the boundaries of comfort. Fingers hovered over the keys for a brief moment, absorbing the attention, feeling the weight of expectation. Then, with a deep breath, the pianist began again, not with hesitation, but with quiet purpose. This time, the music was bolder. Where earlier the melodies had been gentle and exploratory, now they were daring and expansive. The pianist added subtle improvisations, complex chords, and dramatic pauses that gave the performance a dynamic quality. Each phrase carried more emotion, a deliberate weaving of tension and release that kept the audience captivated. Eyes widened, heads tilted, and whispers turned into attentive silence. The pianist could sense the audience leaning in, hanging on each note. The small errors that had caused fear in past practice sessions were gone, replaced by fluidity and confidence. Even moments of improvisation felt natural, as if the piano itself were guiding the hands, suggesting melodies and rhythms that neither could have planned. It was a collaboration between instrument and musician, a conversation that transcended the written music. Every chord struck carried meaning, every pause suggested reflection, and every rising note was a small triumph over fear. One of the influential patrons, seated at the front, leaned forward with obvious interest. The person's gaze was intense, focused entirely on the pianist's hands and expressions. Yet there was a subtle smile that suggested deep appreciation. The pianist felt a thrill, realizing that the audience was no longer passive. The music was moving them, not just entertaining, but touching something deep and personal. The room had transformed from a simple hall into a shared space of emotion and energy. As the performance continued, the pianist found inspiration growing with each passing minute. The initial plan, the set list of pieces, faded into irrelevance. The music demanded freedom, creativity, and honesty. New melodies emerged spontaneously, blending with practiced pieces in a way that felt natural yet extraordinary. The pianist could feel the energy of the room shaping the sound, the audience responding not with words but with subtle reactions, with tension, with relief, with emotion. It was as if the music itself had become a living presence. Halfway through, the pianist noticed a young child in the audience, eyes wide and glued to the keys. There was wonder there, pure fascination, and it brought a new layer of purpose. The music was no longer about personal achievement or technical skill. It was about creating moments that mattered, that could inspire and resonate. Every phrase became more intentional, every crescendo more meaningful. The pianist played not just for the people present, but for the effect the music could have beyond the room, in hearts and minds that might carry the experience forward. Unexpectedly, a small technical challenge arose. One of the piano pedals was sticking slightly, and a chord did not resonate as clearly as intended. In the past, this might have caused panic, a stumble in concentration. But now, the pianist adapted instinctively, adjusting the touch and the timing to compensate. The music continued seamlessly, imperfection transformed into texture, mistake into beauty. The audience did not notice the minor flaw. They only felt the music, uninterrupted and alive. The energy in the room grew more intense. Where earlier the music had been powerful but contained, now it expanded in scope, almost filling every corner of the hall. The pianist's movements became more expressive, shoulders swaying, fingers dancing across the keys, head nodding in rhythm with the flow. It was as if the music had taken over, a force larger than the performer, guiding the audience through highs and lows, quiet moments and crescendos, tension and release. The applause at the end of the second piece was immediate and louder than before. The audience's response encouraged the pianist to continue, to explore further. Another improvisation emerged spontaneously, weaving complex melodies into a rising storm of sound. The room seemed to vibrate with energy, the music reverberating in every corner, filling not just the ears but the hearts of those listening. People sat forward in anticipation, drawn into the unfolding experience, silent but completely present. A few whispers among the audience revealed the recognition of extraordinary skill. Comments like, "I have never heard anything like this," and "such emotion, such depth," floated quietly, not disrupting the performance but affirming that the music had reached its mark. The pianist, though focused entirely on the keys, felt a wave of validation. It was not about accolades or recognition, but about understanding that the music had indeed touched people deeply. Toward the climax of the performance, the pianist felt a surge of inspiration, a moment where every note, every chord, every phrase became bolder and more expressive. Improvisation intensified, flowing like a river breaking its banks, unstoppable yet controlled. The audience reacted instinctively, leaning forward, eyes wide, some smiling, some with hands pressed to their chests as if feeling the music physically. It was more than entertainment. It was a shared experience, a collective immersion in the power of sound and emotion. Suddenly, the pianist realized that the performance had reached a level far beyond what was expected. This small trial, intended merely as a private test of skill, had transformed into a moment of brilliance, of artistry that could not be confined. The music was no longer just notes on a page. It was a story, a conversation, a storm that carried both performer and audience in its flow. The realization brought exhilaration, a mixture of fear and joy, but the music demanded surrender. The pianist allowed it, letting instinct and emotion guide every movement. At the peak, the hall seemed alive, vibrating with the energy of shared connection. The audience could no longer remain passive. They were participants, feeling every rise and fall, every quiet pause and every dramatic flourish. The pianist could sense the collective heartbeat, the rising excitement, and the awe. It was a rare moment when skill, preparation, emotion, and inspiration merged seamlessly, creating something almost magical. When the final notes lingered and finally faded, there was a heartbeat of silence. The room seemed suspended, holding its breath in the afterglow. Then, applause erupted, immediate, powerful, and sustained. People rose from their seats, some clapping, others whistling softly, many with smiles and eyes glistening. It was not polite or obligatory. It was a recognition of something exceptional, a shared acknowledgement that the music had transcended expectation. The pianist exhaled, hands trembling slightly from the intensity of the performance, heart racing with both relief and pride. The music had flowed fully, authentically, and the connection with the audience had been undeniable. It was a moment that would linger long after the hall emptied, a memory etched in hearts and minds. The storm that began as a small trial had fully erupted, leaving a trail of wonder and admiration in its wake. After the applause, the man in the suit approached once more. His expression carried awe and approval, a quiet pride in the pianist's achievement. "Do you see what you can do when you let go of fear?" he said. This was no longer a trial. It was a revelation. The music spoke for itself, and everyone in this room felt it. That is power, and it is yours to command. The pianist smiled, still catching the breath, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The performance had exceeded imagination, surpassing even the boldest hopes. What began as a small test had transformed into a display of talent, courage, and emotional depth that few would forget. The audience's reaction confirmed something the pianist had always believed. Music was not just about skill, but about honesty, connection, and vulnerability. As guests approached afterward, offering praise, questions, and quiet admiration, the pianist realized that this night was more than just a performance. It was a turning point, a moment where the world had opened in a new way. Invitations for future performances, opportunities to collaborate, and recognition of talent began to form in the conversations, casual yet loaded with potential. The pianist listened politely, feeling both exhilaration and the weight of responsibility. The journey was far from over, but this was a first step toward something greater. Walking home later that night, the pianist felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The streets were quiet, the city asleep under the soft glow of streetlights. The memories of the performance played over and over in the mind, the flow of music, the reactions of the audience, the unexpected improvisations, and the connection that had been forged. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered, a powerful reminder that courage, honesty, and passion could transform a small beginning into something extraordinary. That night, lying awake, the pianist reflected on what had occurred. The fear and doubt that had dominated the days leading up to the performance were gone, replaced by clarity and confidence. Preparation had been important, but it was the trust in instinct, the willingness to embrace imperfection, and the choice to play with authenticity that had created magic. The music had become more than notes. It had become a voice, a presence, and a force capable of moving people in ways that words never could. The realization was profound. This small trial had evolved into a defining moment. What had begun quietly in a cafe, with tentative notes and shy melodies, had grown into a musical storm that left the audience moved, inspired, and in awe. The pianist understood now that talent alone was not enough. Courage, honesty, and dedication were equally essential. And as sleep finally arrived, there was a quiet smile, a deep sense of fulfillment, and the anticipation of the journey still ahead. The morning after the performance, the young pianist woke with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. The memories of the previous night were still fresh. The applause, the energy, the connection with the audience. It all felt surreal, like a dream that could vanish if touched too carefully. Yet, the feeling of possibility lingered, a quiet hum of hope that had not existed before. This was more than a single performance. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that had started with a small trial and had grown into something extraordinary. The pianist moved slowly through the apartment, making coffee and preparing for the day, but thoughts kept returning to the performance. The details, once blurry in the rush of emotion, began to clarify. Each improvisation, every daring chord, every pause that had once felt frightening now seemed like a triumph. The realization was profound. Courage, trust, and honesty had carried the music beyond expectation. The small trial had not just been a performance, it had been a revelation. By mid-morning, messages began arriving. Notes from some of the influential guests from the previous night, brief texts from people who had heard about the performance, and even invitations from local venues wanting to host the pianist for future events. Each message was like a ripple spreading from the storm of music the night before. The pianist read them carefully, a quiet smile spreading across the face, knowing that the world was beginning to notice what had always been there. The excitement was tempered with humility. There was a recognition that this was a responsibility, a chance to share something real, not just a gift to be admired. Friends and coworkers noticed the change immediately. There was a brightness in the eyes, a calm confidence in the posture, and a new energy in conversation. The pianist spoke of music with a sense of purpose, describing moments from the performance, the emotions that guided each note, and the connection felt with the audience. Listening to these stories, people could sense not just talent but passion, authenticity, and dedication. It was clear that the performance had left a mark not only on the audience but on the performer as well, shaping the way they carried themselves in the world. That evening, the pianist received a call from one of the organizers present at the performance. The voice on the other end was filled with excitement and admiration. "We would love to feature you in a local showcase," the organizer said. "Your performance last night was unlike anything we have ever seen. People are still talking about it. It's rare to witness such authenticity and skill together." The pianist felt a mixture of pride and nerves. The opportunity was incredible, yet the thought of performing again with even more attention and expectation was daunting. Still, there was no hesitation. This was the chance to continue sharing the music that had been held for so long, to reach more hearts, and to grow as an artist. The next days were a whirlwind of preparation and reflection. The pianist devoted time to refining skills, exploring new pieces, and revisiting old favorites, ensuring that every performance could carry the same honesty and emotion as the previous night. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the pressure felt heavy, but the memory of the musical storm, the audience's reaction, and the shared energy gave strength. Each practice session was a reaffirmation that the music mattered, that it could touch lives, and that courage and expression was more powerful than perfection. In the midst of preparation, the pianist began to receive personal notes from guests and supporters. Some spoke of being moved to tears, others of being inspired to reconnect with music themselves. The pianist read each note with care, feeling the impact of the performance ripple outward. It was a reminder that music was not simply a skill to be displayed, but a force that could reach beyond the immediate, affecting hearts and minds in ways that were subtle, profound, and lasting. This understanding deepened the commitment to continue sharing the gift, not for fame, but for connection. The day of the next performance arrived. This time, the audience was larger, a mix of familiar faces from the previous night and newcomers who had heard of the pianist's remarkable talent. The room was arranged carefully, intimate enough for connection but spacious enough to accommodate the growing interest. As the pianist entered, there was a quiet hum of anticipation. The eyes of the audience held expectation, curiosity, and hope. The pianist took a deep breath, fingers brushing the keys, feeling the texture and weight that had become so familiar. yet now carried even more significance. The performance began with soft, deliberate notes, building gradually into a flowing melody. The pianist felt a calm focus, a clear connection to the music, and a trust in the instinct that had guided every previous performance. Improvisation emerged naturally, blending seamlessly with planned pieces, and the audience responded immediately. There was a sense of shared experience, a collective holding of breath as the music told its story, each listener interpreting the emotions in their own way. Halfway through, a dramatic section arrived, bold and expressive. The pianist's fingers moved swiftly, yet precisely, as the music surged like a river. The audience reacted instinctively, leaning forward, holding their attention tightly. Some smiled, others closed their eyes, and a few seemed caught in the emotion, whispering quietly to themselves or letting the music wash over them in silence. Each reaction reinforced the understanding that music was not only being heard, it was being felt deeply. After the performance, applause filled the hall, sustained and enthusiastic. The pianist exhaled deeply, feeling a mixture of relief and exhilaration. There was recognition here, certainly, but also a profound sense of fulfillment. The music had achieved its purpose: connection. Each note had carried honesty, emotion, and courage, and the audience had responded fully. The small trial that had begun in a quiet cafe had now blossomed into a series of performances that were leaving lasting impressions. Following the performance, opportunities began to emerge rapidly. Invitations to other showcases, private events, and collaborations arrived. Some were tentative, exploratory, while others were clear in their excitement and admiration. The pianist listened carefully to each offer, weighing the potential with the desire to maintain honesty in every performance. The realization dawned that talent alone was not enough. It was the ability to connect through music that created the most meaningful opportunities. In the days that followed, the pianist began to reflect on the journey so far. It had started with a simple, private trial, almost casual in intention, yet it had sparked a series of events that felt larger than life. The lessons learned were as valuable as the recognition itself. Trust in instinct, embrace vulnerability, and play from the heart. The music was no longer a private sanctuary. It was a bridge to the world, capable of touching hearts in ways that words often could not. Friends and supporters continued to offer encouragement. Some shared their own experiences of being moved by the performances. Others offered guidance on handling growing recognition and expectations. The pianist listened with humility, absorbing advice but also understanding that authenticity must remain at the core. The fear of losing honesty in performance was always present, but the memory of past experiences provided reassurance. Connection comes from truth, not polish, and courage in expression creates resonance that cannot be manufactured. Even in quiet moments, the pianist found new inspiration. Sitting at the piano alone, fingers tracing the keys, there was reflection on the journey, from hesitant practice in a cafe to the storm of music that had captivated audiences. Each note carried not just sound but memory, emotion, and growth. The pianist understood now that music was not simply an act of playing. It was a dialogue, a bridge between performer and listener, a living force that could change both hearts and perspectives. As weeks passed, the pianist's reputation grew steadily, but the focus remained on the music itself rather than accolades. Each performance was approached with preparation, reflection, and emotional honesty. Improvisation and risk continued to play a role, guided by instinct and experience. Every audience, whether large or small, was treated as a unique opportunity to connect, to share the truth of the music, and to create moments that lingered long after the last note faded. The pianist also began mentoring younger musicians who showed promise. Sharing lessons learned through personal experience became a way to pass on not just technical skill, but wisdom about courage, honesty, and connection. The students were inspired not only by the talent but by the journey itself, the story of how a small trial could grow into something extraordinary. The pianist encouraged them to embrace vulnerability, trust instinct, and allow music to speak from the heart, knowing that these were the keys to lasting impact. One quiet evening, the pianist sat alone at the piano, reflecting on how far the journey had come. The first hesitant notes played in the cafe. The small trial, the unexpected musical storm, the growing audience, and the recognition all felt like threads woven together into a tapestry. Each moment, no matter how small, had contributed to the path, shaping skill, confidence, and understanding. The music was now a companion, a voice, and a force capable of reaching beyond the performer into the hearts of others. In that moment, there was a quiet realization. The journey was not about fame, wealth, or recognition. It was about sharing something that could touch people deeply, a gift that could resonate in ways far beyond the immediate. The pianist understood that every performance, every note, and every risk taken was part of a larger story. A story that began with courage, honesty, and trust in oneself. It was a story that could inspire, connect, and transform. Looking forward, the pianist felt excitement for the future. There would be more performances, new challenges, and unforeseen opportunities. But the lessons of the journey so far provided a foundation. Trust in instinct, embrace imperfection, and allow music to be a voice of truth. The storm of the small trial had become a guiding force, a reminder that every moment of courage could ripple outward, creating impact beyond imagination. And as the pianist closed the piano for the night, a quiet smile appeared. What had begun as a small piano trial had ended in a jaw-dropping musical storm. But more importantly, it had opened doors to possibilities, connection, and growth that could continue for a lifetime. The journey was far from over, but the path had been illuminated, and the music, honest and alive, would continue to lead the way.